I want to end Chapter 9 by talking about an increasingly important part of relationships during adolescence and emerging adulthood. That is, of course, sexuality. Now, we'll get to talk more about sexual orientation and gender identity in other chapters this semester. So for the purposes of this lecture, we want to look specifically at sexual behavior in relationships during adolescence and emerging adulthood. We know that for most people, the first sexual experience they have with a partner is something we call necking. This might be a term you've heard your grandparents use in the past, but it is, in fact, a term we use in the field. Necking involves kissing and any touching above the waist. And like I mentioned, this tends to be the first for most people. Most teenagers, in fact, experience necking by the age of 16. You can look over here specifically at the average age of first experience for the top two behaviors for males and females. As you'll notice, and this is going to continue to be a trend today, males tend to experience necking earlier by about a year than females do. After that, the next behavior that we see is something called petting. And petting is any touching below the waist. So our next two behaviors on our graph over there. About 60% of boys and 77% of girls have experienced petting by the age of 18. And once again, we see the average age be about 1 year younger for males than females. So yes, boys do tend to become involved in sexual activity about a year younger than their female peers. Moving forwards, we want to look specifically at sexual intercourse. And this could be intercourse involving any gender combination of romantic partners. The average age of first intercourse is roughly 17, which means that most teenagers do not have sex before the age of 18. About 60% of sexually active adolescents report hooking up as part of their sexual experience during adolescence. 60% of sexually active adolescents, though. One thing we're going to talk about a good bit during these next few slides is the idea that people tend to overestimate how many teenagers are sexually active. We know that only about 80% of college students report having had intercourse before. That's during college. During high school, that number is even lower. So, when I say 60% of sexually active adolescents report hookups, that's actually a pretty low number. That's not a common activity for teenagers, adolescents to engage in. So let's look specifically at sexuality and gender for a second. As you may be aware, when it comes to sexuality, there is a double standard for how men and women are treated in many countries. Most cultures around the world have a double standard, where women are judged much more harshly than men for any sexual behavior they engage in, or even sexual desire in general. Some cultures go so far as to encourage premarital sex for men and to physically punish women for the same behavior. So because of this double standard, males and females have very different experiences with their own sexuality during adolescence and emerging adulthood. Just like we had scripts or social scripts for dating, we also have sexual scripts, which comprise of our understandings and expectations of sexual experiences. And of course, these tend to be gender specific. So let's look a little bit more at that. We know that males' sex scripts tend to involve being the one who makes a move, whereas females think that it's inappropriate for them or would make them look, to use a word that I really do not like, easy. So making a move is very discouraged for many women. Males also tend to feel more positively about having sex for the first time and even be more likely to brag to friends about their sexual experiences. Females, on the other hand, tend to include setting limitations in their sexual scripts, meaning that most women feel like it's their responsibility, at least in a heterosexual couple, to be the one to set the limits, to say no, to say this is all we're going to do and this is too far. That can be a lot of pressure on a female and result, I'm so sorry, skip a slide there for a second, result in what we were talking about as harsher judgments for female sexual behavior. Sorry about that slide issue for a second. On the same note, females tend to be more romantic in their sexual scripts, to expect more romance, love, intimacy from their sexual partners than men, and emphasize emotions. A big part of that involves being more afraid of having sex for the first time or becoming sexually active with a partner. So, just like with all social scripts we've talked about, I want to point out that these different expectations are primarily socially constructed. These are just things we've taught males and females to expect, ways we've taught them to behave, and ultimately they can have some negative outcomes. So let's switch back to the percentage of teenagers who are sexually active. We know that 50% of American high school students have not had sex or report not having had sex at least once. That means that only about 50% of teenagers are sexually active. This is, of course, referring just to intercourse, however. Necking and petting behaviors, that number is going to be a good bit higher. We also know that of the 50% of teenagers who have had sex, most of them have only had sex once or twice. So it's not an activity that they're engaging in consistently, but tends to in fact be a very rare occurrence. We know that comparing the 50% of American teens who have and have not had sex, we really don't see many differences in terms of things like self-esteem and life satisfaction. However, non-active teenagers, so teenagers who are not having sex, tend to show higher school performance and greater academic aspirations. Now, I would like to point out here that it is not necessarily, and I think very likely not the case, that not having sex is what is causing better school performance and academic aspirations. These are just correlations, right? So it's likely the case that students who have or who perform better in school, who care more about school, are just less likely to choose to have sex. They also, and this makes a lot of sense, tend to be more religiously and politically conservative. And that's going back to that cultural variable we talked about earlier. The one thing I want to point out here, and this is very important, the age that adolescents are choosing to have sex for the first time matters. I used the term early starter in our second lecture video, and we can apply that same term here. Adolescents who choose to have sex for the first time at 15 or younger are at greater risk for drug and alcohol use. Once again, this is just a correlation. It could be that teenagers who are involved in drug and alcohol use or who are at risk for drug and alcohol use for other reasons are also more likely to have sex younger. But this can be a warning behavior that can help clue us into something, an area where a teenager might need extra support and help. So let's look specifically at emerging adulthood. We talked about how only about 50% of high school students are sexually active in terms of the rate of intercourse. That's not true for emerging adults. And a big part of that is difference in social expectations. Being sexually active is a normal part in most cultures of emerging adulthood. Most emerging adults report having at least one partner in a specific year, one sexual partner. So most emerging adults are sexually active. By the end of emerging adulthood, by the time we're 25, almost all individuals have had sex at least once. But we know that regardless of the prevalence and regardless of what you might have expected in terms of frequency of casual sexual behavior or sexual activities outside of romantic relationships, Most sexual behaviors do occur within that relationship context. Hooking up, one-night stands do tend to be less common than sex within a committed relationship. However, hooking up does become more common in emerging adulthood. It also becomes more socially acceptable, less looked down upon. But we do know that oftentimes one-night stands and hooking up does tend to involve drinking. So these are decisions that even emerging adults tend to make less often than one might have thought. That brings me to the end of Lecture 3. As always, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions.